So I think it's taking people from that how can we call it, unconscious, natural way of doing things. Hey, I'm a natural leader. When I walk in the room, everybody looks. Well, of course they do. You're the boss. But and so they get fixed into this natural ability because I was given this job because of my merit. And what I try to take them in is actually have that sort of that consciousness of every action that they're taking. And I think once they do that, then they start to get the aha.
Welcome to Leadership Disrupted. Today we are joined by Colin Lovering, who's a British national, has lived in Romania for 14 years, has built a successful international career in manufacturing, operations, sales, and business performance consultancy. And if you can tell, I'm reading directly from information from his LinkedIn profile. After working in the UK, in France, and in the USA, Colin founded a business consultancy in Romania in 2011, supporting organizations like HP, KPMG, Oracle, and BMW. He's also the author of multiple books on business psychology and adaptability. He's a qualified emotional intelligence practitioner. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Bucharest and president of the British Romanian Chamber of Commerce. And having had conversations with Colin in the past, he is also a very deep resource into all things leadership related. So, Colin, first of all, welcome to Leadership Disrupted. I'm really excited about just the potential for this discussion, because as we've talked in the past, I don't even know for sure where this is going to go, but I know it's going to go someplace interesting. So I gave the formal introduction. Any gaps you'd like to fill in, or any color commentary on who is Colin Lovering?
Okay, thank you, Noel. I'll just remove my blushes after that wonderful introduction. And no, I think it's fair to say that I've had that sort of that route of life. That I've been fortunate to live in different countries, but also have that career from manufacturing originally through to sales, and then really sort of realizing my biggest thing that I enjoy, I think, is sharing knowledge with people and seeing people succeed in front of my very eyes sometimes. So I think that's the key to it. As you mentioned, I came to Romania a few years ago, and it's been an exciting journey, I think, for me culturally as well. It's as part of, you mentioned the books. I think a lot of the references in the books have really been pulled out of my own personal experiences. So thank you for that, then. Thank you for displaying those books, and then thank you for the very kind introduction.
Well, and speaking of books, there's the old saying, everybody's got a good book in them. You apparently have multiple books within you, which is excellent. And I can't say I've read all of them. I did, after we first met, I did download the Art of Business Adaptability, and I've got my way mostly through that. So there is, again, it's part of what has impressed me in terms of both the breadth and the depth of knowledge and insight. You're not just regurgitating generally accepted wisdom. You genuinely have your own insights into a broad span of things. So maybe let's just start with the theme overall of Leadership Disrupted is that the world is changing, and leaders, in order to be optimal leaders for today's world, need to evolve with those changes. What from your part of the globe, what kinds of changes are you seeing in the leadership space?
Thanks. And I think those changes could be used in different ways. They could be used productively, and they could also be used as an excuse. And this part of the world, it's no different. I think when I'm doing leadership coaching or training anywhere in the world, 85% of it is general, is relevant, and it's just that 15% cultural differences you have. But I think, in answer to your question, I always say, I said at a speech the other night, one of the greatest skills that we all have is hindsight. We can all look back and say, well, if the pandemic hadn't happened, if hybrid working hadn't happened, if that hadn't happened, my job will be easier. And I think what that's triggered a little bit, Dan, is people's reluctance to change because they've been through that, probably the biggest change in business over the last 100 years. They're kind of reluctant to, it's kind of like, well, maybe things will be okay and go back to normal. So I think we're in this sort of vacuum a little bit. Things are starting to change, but leaders are hoping. But what I'm seeing actually is, and it's good for me at my age, is that we're kind of going back to that more empathetic way of leadership. It's about people, it's about emotional intelligence, which it was in my day. And then technology kind of disrupted it a lot. So I think COVID is a contributor. Things have changed quite dramatically in terms of the outcomes of good leadership, I guess, is what we're talking about. We can think we're a good leader, but if it ain't working, we're not a good leader.
And I, one of the things I'm seeing is even those leaders who acknowledge that I need to be more empathetic, I need to have more emotional intelligence. I think I'm seeing how far we've drifted away, because many of them struggle with empathy. How do you teach empathy? How do you coach empathy if someone has lost that? And I had a situation where a leader, it had been identified in his 360 feedback that he was not viewed as being very approachable, not viewed as being very empathetic. And when I first engaged with him, the conversation started with his complaints about the people who had given the 360 feedback. He was frustrated with Gen Z, frustrated with millennials, frustrated with, basically he was expressing a lack of empathy with just about everything. He was mad that nobody wanted to come back to the office. Everybody wanted to work from home. He had a certain way that he wanted to lead the business, and he was very frustrated that his army wasn't marching the way he wanted them to march. They weren't moving forward the way he wanted them to move forward. And then he rolls his eyes and says, and now human resources says I need to learn more empathy, or I need to develop empathy. So, not an easy coaching engagement, at least at first. We eventually got there, but it did take some time.
Yeah.
You have done, in terms of leadership development, you've written books, you've done individual one-on-one coaching, you've delivered keynote speeches, you deliver training both virtually and on site. Is there any of those that you would think of as sort of your natural fastball, like what you enjoy most, or when you are at your best? What is that typically for you?
Yeah, I think just before I answer that, Dan, I'm going to take the point you made, and in defense of that poor soul who was blaming everybody else for it. I think there is, over the last few years, there's a thing in business, and I take a sales department where you have Colin is the top performing sales guy every year, and then the sales manager position becomes available, and Colin naturally gets it because he's got the merit of being a high performer. I call it the Maradona syndrome, Dan. Maradona, the famous footballer who was one of the greatest footballers in the world, and then they made him a manager with no support or infrastructure, and it collapsed for him. It actually damaged his career, probably ended his career in a sad way. And so for that gentleman we were talking about, and many others, I think retrospectively, there's two things that have happened. The organization hasn't given them that updated support and keeping them fresh in leadership and all the new things that are coming along. And at the same time, that person is almost rejecting that because they've been put into this high position. So I think there's a lot of that going on. And in terms of how I approach it, what I enjoy doing most, I think it's taking people from that how can we call it, unconscious, natural way of doing things. Hey, I'm a natural leader. When I walk in the room, everybody looks. Well, of course they do. You're the boss. But and so they get fixed into this natural ability because I was given this job because of my merit. And what I try to take them in is actually have that sort of that consciousness of every action that they're taking. And I think once they do that, then they start to get the aha to it. And I think I hate checkbox training. So if somebody says to me, hey Colin, can you come in and we've got a middle manager or one of the board of directors, we need some coaching. They don't engage on Zoom calls or whatever it is. My first thing I want to do is to speak to that person and find out the real reason, because I think a lot of the time it's probably something else. It could be their manager or the situation they're in, the job they're doing, etc. So I think the fun thing for me is that kind of discovery. I'm doing a project at the moment with a large household name, and I'm actually presenting them the bit of a cold shower in 2 weeks' time. But it's that research, the detective work to find out. And basically, Dan, it comes from my sales experience of not just finding the need, the old expression, the need behind the need. Well, I think the need behind the need behind the need behind the need, if you can discover that in an individual, then they lean forward physically and they're willing to learn and develop. With some people, it's a little bit of catch up. But one frightening thing, you touched on it there about, I need to be more empathetic and emotionally intelligent. And then suddenly you just go straight out and put your arm around one of your people and say, "How are you today?" We probably scare the hell out of them when you do that. So I think there's people like me and you, the phrase coach, mentor, they're all well used phrases, but there is a need for everybody to have that, just to take them on that path, and then let them loose, so to speak, in terms of their own self-learning.
Because leaders, whether they realize it or not, tend to exist in a bit of a bubble where people don't always come to them with direct bad news or direct negative information. Or if a leader, gives a speech to all of his, direct reports and the layers of the organization, it's very unlikely that leader is going to get a lot of critical feedback. What he or she is going to get is people telling them, hey, that was very insightful. That was great. And in fact, there was even a research study. It goes back a few years, but they measured the volume of the laughter of leaders' jokes when told in front of an audience of direct reports versus when told in front of an audience of peers. And
Wow.
what was absolutely true was that when you tell jokes in front of your organization, whether it's 8 people or 8,000, you can't judge how funny you are by the volume of their laughter, because there's just a thing that people do to perform. But the challenge that presents for people like you and me is that when it's time to introduce a leader to something that's less than welcome news, welcome information, less than comfortable information, when you're trying to pierce that bubble, that's a very nuanced skill set. How have you found a way to do that effectively with leaders?
I think it starts with the image, the approachability, and I think your analogy about the analogy was a fact about the laughter. I think that says it all. That laughter is either sort of nervous or just being a little bit afraid not to laugh, sort of thing. So I think there's kind of a shift in how people are being perceived is key. As an example, social media for millennials, if you're being provocative, let's say, or you're being visible on social media, your engagement with your people is going to improve. You won't feel it yourself necessarily, but they will talk about you that way. So I think it's kind of changing the way that leaders are doing things. Another example would be something recently that happened in terms of assuming that because you're a leader, you make all these decisions. Assuming you're a leader, you have to tell all these tough things to your team. And I found with one company I worked with, I talked about their strategy. And I'm giving you a long version to the answer to the question, Dan. But I talked about their strategy, and they explained the strategy. And yes. I said to them, I tried to be unsarcastic with my question. I said, but isn't that just wishes and dreams I'm hearing? Where is the strategy? You're opening an office over there and you're going to put 10 people in it. That's wishes and dreams. And what we found was that they were implementing a strategy, and the leader's biggest frustration is assuming that people don't listen to what they say or don't respect what they say, and therefore they have to berate and do all those other things. So I said to this one company, your strategy is probably a good strategy. Your board of directors have done it, but I bet it's only 75% good. Let's do this. Let's get your whole team together and in a half day, and we're going to create, it was a sales thing, create the sales strategy. Well, of course, we led them a certain way, but afterwards, do you know what the result, Dan, was? 50% of the strategy that was created by the board was kept. 50% was created by the team. And from that moment onwards, you know, he was actually saying to me, Colin, it's not just a strategy, it's just the general feel around every, you know, there's a different feel. People are actually challenging me now. They're approaching me. It's all a little bit different. So sometimes in the training, Dan, and what we can do about it, we don't necessarily have to put all the burden on the leaders to be a better leader. We can just give them these techniques and let everybody else help them along the way.
And all of that started from your willingness to step into that natural tension to say, maybe there's an alternate way to view it. Maybe there's a different way to think it. But you know, given your just given your social skills, I imagine you handle it with grace and appropriateness, so that you don't just poke them between the eyes and have them feel suddenly resistant. But it's an interesting topic, because I think that in today's world, as we see the world evolving, and I mean the evolution of the world, there's so many disruptions. There's technology, there's AI, there's the remote hybrid work environment. There is, we're on 724 phones all the time. Our mobile devices are feeding information to us. They're feeding news, they're feeding social media, they're feeding commercial media, they're feeding entertainment media, but we don't always know which is which. And they're feeding misinformation along with the information. So suddenly your workforce, where 30 years ago, you might have had prime control over what goes into their brains. When you want them to think about your business in a certain way, you tell them, you deliver the information to them, and you had a certain amount of control because there was no competition for their brain space. Now you are at the distinct disadvantage, because day in and day out, they're being fed all of this, not just information, but also misinformation. And we don't know necessarily which is which. So what appears to be entertainment is actually commercial. What appears to be news is actually entertainment, or is actually commercial. And some of it's real and some of it's not real. And particularly in the era of AI, it is very hard sometimes to discern the difference between real and not real. So when you no longer, as a leader, have prime control over what goes into the brain space of your people, it's got to be challenging. And I imagine to be an effective communicator in today's world is so much more challenging than being an effective communicator perhaps 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. Does that prompt any thoughts?
Yeah, it does, Dan. And I gave an example last week, and I said, well, I use you as an example, Dan. So I'd say, imagine Dan's my best friend, and I send him a WhatsApp message one evening, and he says, I'm on my own watching TV this evening. If I don't put a smiley face or a frowny face emoji on it, Dan doesn't know if I'm deeply upset and lonely, or yay, I'm on my own, I can watch the soccer on TV tonight. And I think that's where communication in general has dramatically changed. So I think it's about adaptability. I think the way people want to be communicated to, I have this adage, it's in the Art of Adaptability book. I had to do a plug for the book, is treat people the way they want to be treated, not the way you expect to be treated. And I think that's the fundamental shift for leaders now. They need to understand their people and the diversity of it. And another not great is not the right word for it, but another astounding example of this in the research that I've found is this likability factor that goes on. And what I'm finding, Dan, is a lot of leaders are surrounded by people very similar to themselves, because when it comes to that ultimate recruitment decision, they tend to go, well, I'm going to go with Colin. Dan had a better CV resume, but I think I can work with Colin better. I'm going to choose Colin. And then he chooses another Colin. And before he knows it, he has a room full of Collins, which is the most unproductive thing out. So that, we're bound to get to the word diversity at some stage. but that is what's happening, and that is something that leaders really need to be conscious of and to be courageous with. And when I say diversity, I'm not talking about sexual orientation or gender or age, whatever, but all of those factors create this cognitive diversity that I think leaders are lacking. So I think when you look at their time management, they're spending more time in a reactive zone than a proactive zone. And in that case, they can be absolutely useless to the organization. In fact, you could almost say stay in bed, because you're going to do more damage being a reactive leader than you are a proactive one. So as we said right at the beginning, I think the world is changing. AI, you mentioned, it's scaring me to death, and that's not coming from an old man perspective. It's just scaring me to death. And I think there's one statement I'll say, Dan. I think people on social media are more interested in opinions than they are facts. And I think that's now transcending into our workplace now. They're more interested in what somebody might think than the reality, the strategy, the process, and everything else. And
absolutely. And they're interested in what someone else might think that validates what I think, perhaps with a slightly different skew to make it interesting. So it's not just an echo, but it's a distant echo. So it's not uncomfortable. I'll find it fascinating because I feel validated with what I'm hearing. It's a rare person who actually wants to listen at length to social media or watch social media at length that is the opposite viewpoint or a different viewpoint. I think you're absolutely right. And then of course it contributes to the balkanization of our employees, where each of us ends up in our own bubble, where we're being self-validated. And then you add to that younger employees who tend to be a little less patient. So when they start to work for an organization, and if they get a vibe or a sense in the first couple of weeks or months that their manager, this isn't really their kind of person, or the company doesn't really share their values, or the work is a little more gritty and grungy than I expected it to be, they will, and I'm not judging this, I'm saying this is just the nature of that part of the workforce. They will fairly quickly make the decision to move on and find someplace that is a good fit for them. So it adds even more pressure to managers. I had someone say to me a few weeks ago, she said, I am struggling bouncing between sometimes being a strategist, sometimes being an executioner, sometimes having to be a friend or a mentor or a coach or a guide, sometimes a parent, sometimes a mental health support person. And she said, I don't know how to be all of those things, and also how to figure out which am I supposed to be. So when an employee says to me, I need to take 2 days off later this week because my dog passed away, I have to take that seriously, because for that person, it is serious. And these were her words. She said, my baby boomer brain rolls my eyes and just says, you can't be serious. But I have to mask that because I know, she said, I have empathy. I know it's serious for them. But she said, it is very much a struggle. And I think it is true that leaders today have to be different things to different people.
Yeah, I agree. I think just interjecting there, I think we've created the monster, though, Dan. I think in many ways, I think through COVID in particular, although that hybrid phenomenon was already happening before COVID came along, COVID just accelerated it. But I think what happened from that, because the words like loyalty and commitment and that became so much harder to embrace in people, that it became an employees market. So companies were bending over backwards, so to speak, to do everything they could to, it was all about keeping your people. And I think we as an organization or as a culture, we kind of bent over too far backwards. And I always look at any young person who is 35 years old. And I use the word parenting, and let me explain what I mean by this. We sort of grow up yeah, when I was young, I grew up having that parenting, and it was so valuable to me for my life etiquette and everything I did in the world. And then I went into the workplace, and I had somebody who they called a coach, a mentor, a boss, but really was my continuum, my second parent, my continuum. And I think that's something that's disappeared now, and we see it. You know, a great example is meetings. You know, I'm British. I hate to be late for meetings. I was here 10 minutes before you came online today. I hate being late for meetings. But what's happening now is a double whammy. So people are not only just being late for meetings. I'm not generalizing here, ladies and gentlemen, but people are being late for meetings. But the biggest crime is they don't care, or they're not concerned that they're late for a meeting. And I think this has been born from that we've given everybody too much freedom. We've asked young 25-year-olds, young parents or whatever, who of course are deeply intelligent and grown up and adult. We've asked them to make fundamental decisions in their lives about working from home, for instance, which I don't think we've understood the mental well-being impact of that. And we position it as a question of, do you want to work at the office full time, or do you want to work from home part time? Well, the answer is going to be obvious, because you know, when we're a child, and we all go into child mode, we know transactional analysis. When you're given that question, your automatic answer is going to be the one you have more control on, which is the hybrid working. So everybody took that decision. Companies looked at their surveys and said, everybody's happy, everybody's got what they want. But it ain't the case. And I see it with organizations. Yeah, I don't have coaching sessions with middle managers in particular, Dan, and you've seen this. The senior guys, they can pretty much cope. They got the experience and everything else. It's those middle managers who are trying to satisfy the needs of their teams and satisfy the needs of those people above them. And it's two huge dynamics. They're the ones who are really, really suffering right now. And it's like the old adage of when you if I ask my wife how is she, and she says I'm fine, I know then I have to step away. And I'm finding that people, because they're a manager, will not say, Dan, Colin, I'm struggling. They'll say I'm fine and I'm okay.
You're so right. And they get the least development support. So they have the pressure from the top to deliver results, just like always, and the pressure from the bottom to do things differently, to be a different leader, a better leader, a more empathetic leader. All of these things that do take time. And then you add to that the remote and hybrid work environment, which many of them have, even organizations that have gone back to the office. As I've had conversations with people, they're telling me that employee behaviors have changed. One gentleman said, they're back in the office now, but it's as if they're working from home. Everybody is cocooning in their cubicle, in their office. They are used to working in their mental cave, so to speak. And he said, it's just not, we don't hear the buzz that we used to hear when the office was full. He said, there's a little bit, and maybe it'll snap back eventually. But he said, right now, there's a lot of alone work happening, where he said, we even have teams in the office who will do Teams meetings with each other. So everyone sits in their cubicle and they have a Teams meeting rather than gravitate to the conference room or another physical space. And again, maybe that will evolve over time, but I don't know that you can force it. You have to let it happen over time. You did trigger me. So I have to say two things, because you triggered me with a couple of comments. One was, regarding being late for meetings. And that being, particularly a generational issue, and more importantly, not feeling bad about being late for meetings. I think it's also true of a younger generation of leaders of meetings, and even mid-career managers leading meetings. But in addition to not being sensitive to starting on time, what I'm also seeing is not being sensitive to ending on time. When particularly in the world of back-to-back meetings, when someone says, okay, I know our time is up, I've just got two more things, my heart just sinks, because I can't leave this meeting, but there's another one that's already starting up or trying to start up. I love it when someone is leading a meeting and 3 minutes in advance or even 5 minutes in advance. Or my heart just sang a week ago, a meeting was finished. It was an hour meeting, but at the 25-minute mark, we'd accomplished the goal. And the leader of the meeting said, there's no rule against ending early. So she just ended the meeting and we all went our merry way. But that's the rare exception.
But your memory of that, I would say your memory of that was, if somebody says about, well, there's two things happened there. The memory of that meeting was it a good meeting? And our response is not the technical answer about what happened in that meeting. It's the emotional, it was a great meeting because it actually finished early, allowing me to do what I did. And the other thing from that is when that person calls another meeting, there's more people likely to be enthusiastic to join it because they know that it's efficient and going to finish early and everything else. So I think there's a lot that people can learn from, being very clear right at the beginning, and say, thanks for seeing me. This is going to take no more than 30 minutes. Is that okay for you? Get a response from that person, and then you're more likely to get that attention. And you're right, Dan. You physically. I did an event. And I stood up in front of about 200 people and I introduced myself and I said, actually, I'm a priest. And they all kind of looked at me. I said, well, I feel like one now because you're all praying, because they're all sort of bowing their heads, which is a perfect way of making sure nobody looked at their cell phones throughout the whole presentation. But no, you're right. That attention and that guilt of doing things wrong. It's almost like well, I'm not going to get fired for it, so it's okay. It's like that little bit of rebelliousness that people can finally put in there. And again, we've got to help people understand that that's not right and work with them on it. Otherwise, the situation like AI is going to get worse before it gets better in terms of communication, I think.
Well, and there are, of course, big impacts of AI, but there are also the little micro impacts. For example, there are a number of AI tools now that will listen in on your meeting and will create a summary of meeting notes, and they'll provide those notes to the meeting holder, the meeting leader, and then that meeting holder can distribute those notes, which on the face of it, very cost saving, very time saving, very comforting. But at the top of the notes, always there's a line that says, please review and validate. And what I've noticed lately is people just forwarding those notes then to everyone. So a meeting of 18 people, and then the meeting leader forwards those notes to everyone. And at the top is please review and validate. I'm thinking this is AI creating a new challenge for us, because we don't want 18 people reviewing and validating. We want one person reviewing and validating. That should be the meeting holder should review and validate, and then strip that line out and just send the meeting notes. But I think AI tools are introducing new challenges for us that we have to be ready for, or at least think our way through to develop new work habits and new patterns.
Yeah, you be smart with it. Just on that, Dan, I did a thing. This was on emails because I was convinced. I had a team about 10 people. I was convinced they weren't read. I don't write long emails; they're not that long, but I was convinced people weren't read. So I sent an email, and at the bottom of it, I put it sort of right at the bottom before the thanks Colin bit. I put, can you reply with telling me? I think it was what is the capital of France? And it was about 4 days before the sales meeting, and I went to a sales meeting, and I'd received 3 emails with Paris written on it, and the rest hadn't. And when I revealed it, they all were like, so that proved my point. That proved my point, I think. So
I have been
one other thing I would say, just thinking about it with AI, and I think it's a fabulous tool, and it's a fabulous tool for generating ideas as well. But putting your own spin to it whenever you can, if you're writing something, for instance. But one thing I found, and I've never ever used this word for the whole of my life, is the word foster or fostering. So if I ever see the word foster or fostering in a document, I know that AI, because AI loves the word fostering and foster. So everybody watching this, if you do try to send something out as your work and it is AI generated, just change that word fostering and foster. Then nobody will ever know.
So I have also discerned a couple of tells that I am not going to communicate on this podcast. So when I'm reading like someone else's article on LinkedIn, or when I'm reading someone else's lengthy email message that they've sent out, I've started to be able to discern when this feels like AI.
Yeah.
And so, but again, I don't want to give away my tells, because I don't want people to get better at this. In fact, what I think is important is that AI is treated as a really smart intern who will do some of the initial work for you, but you have to bring your own insight. You
Yeah.
have to bring yourself to whatever you're using AI to do. If you're truly just inputting and outputting from AI, and first of all, know that many of us will know, and also know that it does have over time not a great impact on your personal brand within an organization.
Yeah. I used to play darts years ago, Dan, and I would do the scoring, in my old mathematics way, sort of thing. I did it.
Mm-hmm.
Now I see people do with darts, and they're using the I went to school when they didn't have couldn't use calculators and everything else. So I think you're absolutely right. There is a danger of our brains, our ability to think for ourselves. It's already happening in the last 2 years, I think. Well, I think we see it with people, that ability to do that is becoming less and less and less, coupled with the working from home and maybe listening to the child all day as well, and having child conversations and not adult conversations. All of these things that are happening. And as I said, most of the some of the coaching sessions I do quickly turn into therapy sessions because of this. People don't quite know how to manage it all.
So back to one of the original topics we started with, leaders inside their bubble, not always having the greatest self-awareness that might be optimal or ideal. How do you help leaders self-reflect? Because I do think as we go forward into this new world, because the changes that we're talking about, it's not as if those changes have happened and now they've stopped. The world is going to continue to evolve and grow, and I don't know how to help leaders take the time to self-reflect, take the time to acknowledge, I have a gap here, I have some development here. It might be developing my social skills, it might be emotional intelligence, it might be AI and technology, it might be all of those things. It might. I had a gentleman, this goes back about a year, but he did say, as I spent a lot of time reflecting on what I needed to be to lead my organization, he said, I've grown up in the business. He had spent 25 years, almost 30 years at the same company. And he said, the one organization I've not been a part of is the sales organization. He said, I started in operations. I moved on to finance. I moved into marketing, had a little brief stint in HR, which was kind of an executive prep stint for me to move into the C-suite. And he said, I realized after a lot of thought and conversation and reflection that I had kind of a negative attitude toward the sales organization. I felt like we created the product, we marketed the product, we did the work, and the sales, they were basically talking catalogs. They just went out and verbalized. And he said, I realized I had this big gap if I was going to truly lead the organization. And he, even though he didn't have to, he assigned himself a stint within the sales organization, and he went on sales calls. And so he started he didn't start at the bottom, but he engaged on actual sales calls, engaged in sales planning discussions, engaged at a much deeper level than he had ever before. However, none of it would have happened if he hadn't first taken the time just to think through, where are my gaps as a leader. But that's so rare. I don't think it happens a lot.
I don't think it does. Well, for the reasons we talked about, and it's not ego. It's just that defense system they have. It's that vulnerability of showing that we have that vulnerability to our team, because our team expect us to be the leader, the manager. It's more extreme in certain cultures. Here in Romania, it's a very extreme thing. I think what we need to do is, because the challenge for leaders is that that they have KPIs like everybody, but their KPIs are pretty fundamental. They're financial, their bottom line KPIs. It's business, and we look at the outcomes of what they do. It has to be a business outcome, the benefit to the business, and not themselves. And I think if we can actually help leaders realize the personal outcomes of their actions, it's kind of a sales. I'll let away my sales techniques. If I'm approaching a company, I want to be less as a salesperson as possible. So I normally send out a form with a set of statements. I would like my people to be more engaged. I'd like our sales team to just a few statements, and I just ask people, just tick the 4 that would mean most to you personally, and they tick their 4 and choose one which is the biggest one for you. And then when I go to see them, I go straight into this thing of what's valuable for them, and that's kind of an outcome for the business. But then I start to get into a conversation. It's almost like an interview going on. Is what is the personal outcome? I had one person, and this was about 2 years ago. The outcome of me doing business with him, for instance, was that he could spend more time with his granddaughter at weekends. It was a profound thing, because I'd heard him mention 2 or 3 times. So I said to him, if you could spend more time with your granddaughter at weekends, how would you feel? And I remember his look on his face. There was no tear, but it was like, oh, Colin, tell me about it. And I told him about it. I told him what I could do that enabled his time to be better resourced. And the outcome wasn't more efficiency, better sales, and whatever, all the other things that we managed to do. It was a KPI system I wrote for him. The outcome for him was that. And I think the leaders need to realize that they're human beings. We understand that, and really, if you focus on what it means to them, we have a terrible expression in England called getting home and kicking the cat, the proverbial cat. When you've had a bad day, hopefully if you have a cat, you don't do it. But it's kind of, and we know that a lot of leaders, we talked about COVID earlier on. We talked about hybrid. If you do a survey on every single company, who are the people who spends more time in the office than anybody else? It's the leaders. Why is that? Why are they doing all of that? Why are they going home and kicking the proverbial cat? Why are they being up at night and keeping themselves awake at night with worries and everything else? Because their whole outcome focus and pressure is on the business and not themselves. And we can flip that on its head and show. I'll give you an example for myself. I took up golf again a few years ago, and now, to be honest, Dan, because I'm at my age and I can walk 4 hours on a golf course carrying a bag the same weight as a 13-year-old child, I'm grateful for life. So now I don't grip that golf club so hard. It doesn't go in the trees anymore. I relax. I'm happy. And my golf buddies are saying to me, what happened? Did you have golf lessons? And I said, no, I'm just grateful for being out here. And so consequently, my golf game now is better than it's ever been in my life. And I think that's really what I'm trying to say is with leaders is the more that we can focus on the personal outcomes to them, then we know that when they walk in the office, and it will be measurable, it will be physically measurable. People will say, did you see Colin? He came in, he said good morning to me. He's smiling. He just made me a cup of tea. What's going on? Has he had a bang on the head? And that's when I think a leader transforms into, when somebody comes in and say, hey boss, what do we do? Instead of telling them what they do, they say, what do you think we should do? And they start to delegate and they start to get this balance. So I think that's the magic of leadership is helping leaders to realize themselves that without them the company is going to struggle. So we need to look after you, my friend, sort of thing.
Well, and we acknowledge that leadership is such a challenge, and the larger the organization is that you're leading, the more variety of people, the more variety of issues that you have to deal with. It is a challenge, and leaders typically are promoted because they make decisions, because they get things done, because they make things happen. But oftentimes what was a strength, when it's overused or when you index too far into that strength, ends up not only being potentially a weakness, but a huge stressor. So when a leader asks the question, why am I having to carry all of this weight? Why am I the only person who seems to be thinking deeply about this? I would say pause and ask that question again and again, and don't just go for the surface answer. Don't just say, well, it's because I can't count on them. Okay, well, why? Why can't you count on them? And think about that deeply. Well, because they don't put in the hours. Well, why don't they put in the hours? Or why don't they? Or it may go as deep as, why did you select them for these roles then? I mean, in the end, asking those why questions, but asking them deeply. But it's not just that, whether it's a leader who is extremely loyal to his employees or his or her team, that loyalty can be, when you index too far into loyalty, it can become a weakness. When you index too far into empathy, it can become a weakness. When you index too far into analytics, it can become a weakness, which is, we can acknowledge that leadership today is multifaceted, is very challenging, and there's no like single one solution. You can't take 50 leaders and put them through a training program and then they all come out, yep, this is what leadership is. It is more of a, you can build the fundamentals, but ultimately every leader has to figure out her own path or his own path to what works specifically for them and their people.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you, and I think more we can do that. And I think any leaders watching this video is to really sit and think about it, a bit like the dear man with his grandchildren. Maybe that's one of them. I want to spend more time with my kids. Give us 3 outcomes of anything you do that would make a difference to your life and your kids and your wife or your husband, grandchildren, whatever it is. And I think that's the best starting point to start you on the way. And another thing, Dan, it takes away that, I think it gives that person more confidence and more career minded. Even when they're in their 50s or 60s, they're still career minded, because there's nothing worse than having a brick wall for a boss who's very loyal, but doesn't have that ambition and is just in a reactive mode all of the time. That's when people start to leave the organization, because they don't see the route. We want that succession planning. We want that nurturing of people. I always say the best leaders surround themselves with people much smarter than they are. That then you can really do the things that you're really charged with. And I think most of us, Dan, when we look at our job titles and then do a time emotion and look how much time we spend, it's a bit like in the soccer analogy. You got your striker, and then you say, actually, I want you to play in goals today. Well, why do you want me to play in goals? Our goalkeeper hasn't turned up. Well, no, that's not going to work. That's not going to. And I think a lot of the time when people look at how much time they spend doing the thing, I think the things we're best at, and you asked me this question, what do you love doing? I think the things you're best at is those things that you love doing most. And what we've got to get leaders doing is leading, is being inspirational and motivational, looking at the 5-year, 10-year future of the company and being that person that people really see as that true leader, and not somebody who's just being a reactive manager, if you like, all of the time. So, and
that thought process can actually start at the very beginning of someone's leadership trajectory. If you're a frontline leader of a team of 8, you can still ask yourself the question, what do you want to stand for? What do you want this team to stand for? What do you want from this experience, from this environment? What do you want to facilitate happening? And by asking those questions, you make it more than just a supervisor role. You make it more than just a manager role. And if you can tap into those individual human beings, it can begin a habit or a pattern where you understand, yes, you're leading a business, yes, you're leading a team, but ultimately you're leading individual human beings. And I had a great conversation with a marketing leader who was struggling with a senior executive who didn't really like engaging with customers directly, So this was a senior executive who loved the demographics of the customers, who loved to study customer trends, who loved to, he would say that he knew the customer better than anyone else in the company because he had all kinds of data, but he did not like engaging directly with customers. Partly he was more of an engineer and not as much of a people person, but also he had never been coached that this would probably be something that he had to get through, because you can take all of that data, but if you're lacking the real world visceral experience of sitting down with a customer as they experience the product or service, or sitting down with a customer and discussing their experience of the product or service, or just getting to know them as human beings, if you have literally none of that and only data, it is going to have a detrimental effect on your overall leadership of the business. I have one last question, Colin.
Sure.
And first of all, this has been fantastic. But this question that I like to kind of end with is, you, given your experience, given your decades of experience in leadership development, in leadership coaching, what's been the one experience for you personally that has had the most impact on you personally as a leader? Since I have asked this question of multiple leaders, and I generally don't prepare them for it because I really want them to go deep and think back. Most of them go way, way back. And I would say, when I think about what has had the biggest impact on me as a leader, I have to go back to my teens. I was in the Boy Scouts of America. I was an Eagle Scout, and I had a particular Scout master who was my father was in the Army, so we were in an Army Scout troop, or a Scout troop sponsored by the Army. And I still remember his name. His name was Lieutenant Henderson. First name was Alan, but we never called him Alan. It was Lieutenant Alan Henderson. And I'm sure by now he has passed away. But there was something about the way he led each of us in that troop. Number one, he had huge competence. He had been a scout all of his life. So with all of the aspects of scouting, we knew we could go to him to ask and get guidance about anything. It might be if we're on a winter camping trip. We went on a survival camping trip, and he knew exactly how to set up the campsite so that we could stay warm during a very, very cold weekend. I mean, every aspect of scouting, he was a strong, deep resource of knowledge. So he was highly competent. So we trusted him. We would, if he said march in this direction, we would march in this direction. But then he was always focused on helping us learn. So he wasn't giving orders. He wasn't saying march in this direction. He would say, let's figure out what direction we need to march. Let's figure out what direction we need to hike. And then he would expose his process. He would expose what he knew and what he learned, and the why behind things. So it wasn't just, all right, it's freezing right now, lay down this tarp, then lay down this layer, then do this. Yes, he would give us those directions, but he would always give us the why behind it. Because as I think back now, what I realize is what was driving Alan Henderson was the desire to impart that knowledge to us, to help us learn not just what to do, but the why behind it. And he has just always struck me. I stayed in touch with him for a few years, and then, as we do, we drift away. But he is someone who struck me as the kind of leader that everyone respected, and vice versa. He respected everyone. And you take any group of 18 or 20 boys, there are going to be some really good kids there, and there were some real jerks. I mean, it's just true of any group of 18 or 20 boys. He always found a way to connect with each of us, even those that I would consider to have been, kind of borderline jerks. And so I take that away. For me, that was one of my formative experiences. Now, and I'm not saying, I guess I'm just asking you, as you think about
you prompted one in my mind in a similar vein. It's really an experience that had an impact on me as a leader, basically, in the way that I became a leader, and it was many, many years ago. And it is the dear old gentleman who's no longer with us anymore. Ron was my old sales manager, and you know what I find about these great leaders is you don't quite realize they're a great leader until long after it, and then you look back and go, wow. And one thing with Ron was and one thing he taught me as well was that he'd always ask me how I was, and then dig a little bit deeper. And then the next time he'd always sort of say to me, so how's your little boy? How's Dan? He'd know the names and everything else. And this kind of like started what I didn't realize is this relationship that he was building with me. But one of the fundamental things that he did, I think it's a leadership example, but I remember going to I actually wrote it in my second time I've mentioned my books, in my first book, where I went to, I remember it was February in North England, and it was a freezing cold day, and I was a guy who liked to show off my nice Ralph Lauren shirt or whatever, and he had his big coat on and scarf and gloves, and we'd come from a customer, and one of the things when he went to see a customer with him, and what the point I'm getting to is about respect as well, about leaders showing respect. So what he did whenever I was with a customer, so let's say, me and you were you were the salesperson, he'd always tilt his chair, make sure I don't go out of the picture, 45 degrees away from the customer towards me. And what he wanted to do was he didn't want the customer to be looking at him and overtake the meeting. So, and that was the way he would do things. He would only engage his eye contact with the customer. The customer asked him something specific. And that's one thing that he did. And I was like a 27-year-old, ripe young sales guy. And then coming out of this meeting, I remember, and I couldn't wait to get over to the car and start the engine. I was freezing. And I jumped into the car and I went to start the engine. And I told this story so many times, but Ron's had these big hands, and he put his big hand over mine. He said, before you start the engine, what are they saying about you right now? And he embedded this into my head, and I used this, and I told this story so many times, and what he meant by it was, if somebody came into that room and says, hey, who was that? Oh, it was Colin from ABC company. How did it go? The answer would not be a technical one like we touched on earlier. It would be an emotional one. I like him. We can do business with him. And that was one thing he installed in me as a leader, that he showed me respect even at a young age, but when he taught me things, he did it in a fun way. It was a bit parent-child, some of it, like that example was a little bit, but he kind of made me like, yeah. And it wasn't until afterwards, I would actually realize it. So everything I do in life, Dan, even this call today, I'm just getting over a bad cold, so my voice is a little bit better. And yesterday I sounded like a midnight trucker DJ in middle of the night, 2 a.m. Hey truckers, but I'm better now. But everything I do it with that sole intention that at the end of it, I want that audience or that person in a meeting, that customer, to say, I like him, we can do business with him. And I think that's a bit for leadership, where we become too technical. A bit like golf, you watch too many videos, you'll never do any better. Put a bit of passion, confidence, and emotion into it, and you can play good golf. And I think that's where leadership needs to be taken back a little bit, like we said right at the beginning, back to the good old days of the emotion and the feelings and trust and benevolence and all those wonderful words that we tend to forget.
The kind of self-awareness, or maybe that's the wrong word, the kind of situational awareness that it takes to be conscious of not facing the customer directly, but facing the sales rep, because making the sales rep the center, putting the sales rep in the limelight, so to speak. And then the situational awareness to, as you sit in the car, to be thinking, okay, what is going through the customer's head right now? Let me help this sales rep develop a pattern of thinking that through. That's huge. I can imagine, like those little things over time can have a huge impact on any of us. Whatever the insights might be that a leader would share with us.
Yeah, so I was the boss, Dan, and I think any leader, if you're in a manufacturing company, you go out to the factory floor, you're not the boss. That guy running that machine, he's the boss or she's the boss. And if
Yes.
you treat them like that, treat people the way you want to be treated, and then you get the respect back. Sorry, I jumped in there a little.
No. I am imagining, Colin, this is the first of what will likely be many ongoing conversations, because as you and I have experienced when we weren't recording, you and I can go on and just talk about things that hopefully other people find interesting as well. But I particularly find it fascinating to tap into your expertise. So what I want to do is, first of all, remind everyone that you are an author. If you want more of Colin Lovering, you can certainly access his books. You can go to his LinkedIn profile. You can connect with Colin individually if that makes sense for whatever particular reason. But beyond that, I just want to say thank you. I deeply appreciate this, and I just appreciate the generosity of your spirit, like willing to share these thoughts and ideas. And hopefully we'll get to do it again sometime.
Thank you, Dan. No, I appreciate it. I've enjoyed it myself. I think we could talk for hours.
Absolutely. So for those of you, if you're still with us here, and if you're getting value out of this, hit that like button, that subscribe button, and you'll be notified when we have additional interviews that come to the channel. So thanks, everybody. Bye now.